is that, there was a long, kind of like mentoring, like training, um, the time to value, I guess, for a new inside sales rep was kind of long, I thought. Training was really tough. We ended up putting together, I think, like a 250 page or something crazy, um, a PowerPoint deck on how to get around the system. But people would see it for the first time and sometimes not come back the next day for work. And so the user adoption was tough. And so we saw there was an opportunity to like, well, if we could do things in a more modern system, right, and have that be really what we're working with every day, then we could, probably get some of these newer reps up to speed a lot faster. Plus, there's going to be a tons of other advantages to using that type of like data architecture, right? So, in addition to things like that time to value being long, there was, just kind of lack of data or data, transparency or reporting capabilities. We had like, a lot of duplicate entry work that was being done between systems. So jumping from one system to the next, right? We had HubSpot, and then we also had the AS400. So, you were just bouncing back and forth all the time to try to get your information. Plus, you had other kind of manual reports you might had to have to download. A lot of data silos, right? And I think those are some of the main driving factors to why we wanted to say, all right, well, let's figure out a way to integrate these systems so the team can spend less time in AS400 and more time in HubSpot, and then use HubSpot as that really 360-degree view of what's going on, bookings to sales, orders coming back in, like how do we get everything talking so I don't have to really go look hard to find what I need.
Absolutely. Well, that makes a lot of sense. So basically, we were running into just difficulty with the usability and user experience of these legacy systems.
Yeah, time savings too. That was a big one, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think as we approach the project, you talked about a lot of different features and capabilities here. So, you know, I, this team was who did the work, and so I guess I'll let Chris, or ask him to speak a little bit to, what Zach was saying from a strategy perspective. How did we sort of map everything out and get it figured out so that we could actually do the work?
Yeah. I think obviously it was helpful in this case. Zach was a champion coming in, and HubSpot was more well understood in compared to most cases that we run across. And that's why like my role in this is really to help the team understand like, okay, what's HubSpot's role, right? In for the company, because that drives a lot of the conversation and makes it a lot easier to say, okay, we've already decided this thing. We don't need to relitigate it every time we run into an issue or every time we run into like, oh, this new process is going to be impacted. Do we really want to do this? Right. So, two things that jumped out when Zach said, like people literally not showing up the next day because it's too hard to do their job, right? The systems and the tools that people need to get their job done, and the expectations they have, the KPIs, the quotas, all that stuff, right? And two, that 360 review of the customer, right? And if we understand, if we help from a mindset perspective that this is HubSpot's primary role in any organization is to provide usability of the system so that you can have that view of the customer, it becomes a different conversation, and it's less about which systems are being integrated and more about, okay, to achieve those goals, we need this data in HubSpot. We need these teams, these customer facing users to be in HubSpot, right? Now we can have a conversation about less about the system. We handle that. It's not about, because another challenge right now, mindset wise, this is new for HubSpot, right? This is an extensibility that hasn't always been around. So the likelihood that you're going to find somebody with AS400 integration experience with HubSpot is highly unlikely. So are you asking the right questions? And as we prepared for this, it's about like the scoping exercise is everything, right? And we put the work in to do that. The customer invested in that, right? Because it takes time and energy and thought, right? So it's not some free discovery call, right? And we'll figure it out later. We got to figure this out right now so that we can scope effectively and then resource it properly.
Well, and speaking of that, so the the person on this call that probably has had the deepest dive into all of this physically and emotionally, Dean, um, how would you say that we did on our scoping, and how did we where did we land technically in terms of actually delivering the solution to the customer?
Um, from a technical point of view, of course, you know, the more kind of user interfacey type things, that doesn't really concern me. What I'm concerned about is what data is coming from HubSpot and where does it need to go, and vice versa as well. What data comes from the legacy system that needs to get into HubSpot? And so when I started my work, you'd already well defined what those data flows were. And that is key to getting a successful integration. You know exactly when you start, before you start, exactly where the data is coming from, and exactly how it's going to be mapped into that legacy system.
Right.
And that was already well defined for me. So I was very happy about that when I got the spec. A little bit more, you know, like you said, there's not many people are going to have experience of getting data from a cloud system into an AS400. So our main technical challenge there with any integration of a legacy system, the first thing you have to find out is what is my way into this legacy system? What is the best way to get data in there and get data out? And in this case, there was a database interface that we could use. Not a very sophisticated database interface, a somewhat unreliable database interface, but something that we could use to access data in the legacy system and push data into the legacy system.
Yeah.
So we did have somebody in the AS400 side who was helping us. They set up some, you know, some transfer tables, staging tables that we could work and create that interface by. And then it's just a question of, you know, writing something that you can easily, you know, so basically with a modern system, you have an API on virtually every system now. But we don't, or we have an API on HubSpot, but we don't have an API on AS400. So my job is to basically put an API on it. And that you do by writing an application, which is the API. It accepts the data. It then uses the database connection to push it into the legacy system.
Yeah.
And that was my job.
So we were uniquely this was a unique challenge, I think, in terms of, I mean, I guess it's not a unique challenge that teams run into, but um, the level of technical understanding and the depth that we had to go to make this successful and possible. Like, I guess a different way, I'd like to underline what Dean said. I made an API, right? Like the level that was required technically was pretty deep. Um, and you know, to sort of bring it full circle, you know, the integration that we wrote functionally at the moment is a quote to quote integration. So we do a quote inside HubSpot, it integrates to a quote inside the AS400. But, you know, when you think about why you do something like that, like that's cool. But in the 2025 roadmap, we're going order to order. So we're going to have a quote inside of HubSpot turn into an order in HubSpot with order line items or deliverables, and then send that data across to the AS400 for processing. And so we're going to have almost a fully automated system all in HubSpot where from the quote that you've created, you now have all of your order information. And the thing that's going to be absolutely killer is also the data coming back from the AS400 and how we'll be able to expose that to end customers with a portal.
That's what I'm really excited about is that part. When we can start, getting the data flowing back into HubSpot and then doing some meaningful things with it and then leveraging some workflows and automations to improve the customer experience. I think that's kind of like when I looked at this from the very beginning, part of it was I need better transparency for how to manage these teams, what's working, what's not, right? There was that kind of need. But then I was also like, the customer experience could be a lot better here, right? And I think when Chris and Bill, like when we first met, we talked about like that Amazon experience, right? I think that was the first time that Chris was like, "All right, I think I like this guy, Zach." And I just saw all this, and there still is today, right? Because we're still working on the integration, but there's a lot of manual work, right? So I've got to download the quote and review it and then send it, or I have to download, these, acknowledgement and then send it, or I have to manually run an order report for my customer to tell them like what they have left in inventory. It's like the data's there. Why can't we just throw that into some kind of automation where they get an email for that every day, every week? Why not have a customer portal where they can just get live? So a lot of it was for me is like, how do we just make this easier on the customer? um, because there's a lot of value in that, right? Especially when people have a lot of options today to go, different directions. They're going to want to work with people where it's easy.
Yeah. And we talked about the internal customer like in the first part of this session. Now we're talking about the external customer
Yeah.
experience, and it almost always comes back to that. Um, and just doing that work up front to really understand those sides. Because I remember we did a session where, the person quoting out of the AS400 right now took us through the process, and you got to be able to uncover all the areas of tribal knowledge where they've
Hmm.
been doing it for 5 years. So they thankfully don't need to look at the 150 page, user manual that they probably created. And when you find those things, you start to find all these gaps. And a laser question that I love to ask is, does the external customer, ever need to see this data? Or do you ever want them to know this data? And so many times, this is where even when you get the buy-in at leadership level for a portal, which is not hard to get usually, what's hard is everything that needs to happen to make that portal work. And when you find out that most people will look at the systems, and now it's a systems-based approach, and like, okay, how do we get this data? But when you ask that question, people just go look in the systems. Oh, we'll show them that. Sometimes this is on a quote, but then you uncover things like, do you ever send them tracking information? Okay, that's a piece of data and it goes via email, and that's not the best way to go about it. So at the end of the day, uncovering those points of data so that we can give somebody like Dean a map. But also, I want to double click, Dean, we still needed somebody with AS400 experience to help. So even though I said like that's not the best way to frame it, that doesn't mean you don't need that kind of help, because HubSpot did not magically just flow in, right? We had to set up SQLs, we had to set up APIs. So the difference in what we're talking about is when you go and try to find somebody with the AS400 experience first, right? They're almost never going to have the knowledge of HubSpot that they need to address the strategy and the mindsets that we're talking about here.
Yeah. So you're proposing basically find a team of technical people that can build you the technical operating system, but then there also needs to be a RevOps thought process.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
And
like,
like,
I remember I was initially tasked to, you know, well, it was my idea. So it's like, be careful what you wish for, right? And so then I'm like, all right, great. We have to find people to go do this now, right? Like I have the RevOps, I have the strategy stuff. I know what I want it to look like. But I don't have the skill set. I'm not a software engineer, right? I've never, like this, it's not my thing. And then I searched. I mean, I spent a lot of time looking for companies that did specific, AS400 HubSpot integrations and came up with like almost nothing. I think that, it's like it was through, referrals and talking to people that finally I came across, Chris. And, and you had the relationship with Bill and Dean, and it just kind of all came together. But it wasn't because there was anyone waving a flag that said, hey, we do AS400, integrations with HubSpot, and that's our thing. So yeah, it was definitely like you had to have all those pieces together. The person who had the strategy and the vision, then you needed the people who had all the technical capabilities to go do that, and line all of those, puzzle pieces up that, it's like I had to just have trust, right, in the team. And it wasn't because anyone came to me and said, yeah, we've done this before. It was like, yeah, we've done things like this before.
Yeah.
Right? It's like we have those core competencies, right? We're able to, like, think critically, and we can, put all of our human brains together and go solve this problem. And I liked you, I liked Bill, and there was a kind of a relationship that we had built. I'm like, I trust these guys to do what they said they were going to do, and it's been great working with everybody.
Yeah. Well, I see a question or comment that Alexa just
Yeah.
posted related to, the biggest problem being in finding an integration partner who has both the technical knowledge and also the sort of RevOps knowledge. And, what you're looking at the top of your screen is sort of the four horsemen of the integration apocalypse in a way. Because of that exact, that I think when you're interviewing teams to do this work for you, it's important that you have that sort of end to end, from strategy and like sort of CMO, COO, even level thinking into specification, into proper management of a project like this, and into correct deployment. And project like this, the other thing that I think we need to make clear, and this is true for more modern integrations as well, is they are software development projects. So, something I don't know if we'll really even get into today, but to highlight is that, this project was managed, as a software development project, including releases, project plans that were extremely detailed related to what we were going to build, understanding, code review, solution architecture, technical architecture, functional design documents. Like there are things that went into this that are much more sort of traditional software implementation. And I think that, HubSpot is something where we're so used to everything just working when we click the button that, that we sort of forget that there's actually unbelievable engineering feats happening in the background to make that possible. And when you get into something more custom, like an integration, you're really looking for more of a team that would build you another HubSpot, like that level of team, more than you are like it's not just RevOps, it's not just the software people, it's that sort of full understanding is going to be needed because you're basically building a product. So
Yeah, it's like if fail to plan, plan to fail when it comes to this kind of stuff. If you don't really do your due diligence and scope it out well, and just be very organized with your project plan and milestones and deadlines and all that. I mean, it would be a recipe for disaster, right? I mean, it was a risk, I guess if you really think about it, right? It's a risk for me to hire a team I've never worked with before, where if they totally blew the project up, like I probably would have been out of client, right? Um, and so I think that just stresses like how important these things are. I've heard, it wasn't with our group, of course, but I've heard other horror stories of, implementations and integrations going, just tragically wrong and resulting in big dollars in terms of, losses. So you just got to make sure that you're hiring, good people, that have good experience, and a lot of that experience is like we're good at the planning stuff, like we're good at the documentation, we're good at the strategy, so I think that's important to mention.
well, and I'd like to, okay, so I'm going to ask for a round robin with our 5 minutes left because I think this is sort of converging into a pretty interesting point. I'd like to ask each of you, if you were interviewing a technical team that was going to help you with a project like this, what would you be looking for? What are some key questions that you would be asking? Who wants to go first? Okay, well, you're pointed then left to right. Zach, you're going first.
I was waiting for someone else to start talking.
Yeah, right, exactly.
What would I be looking for? So And I think, having an understanding of some other like examples of projects or some use cases, some things that you guys have done before, right? Is it the same exact thing? No. Is it close enough? Right? Kind of a deal. Understanding like what's your approach to this?
Mhm.
Like, how, like what, what are, how are you going to solve this problem? Like, what are the steps you're going to take to do that? Not just like, yeah, we got this. I think like, some of the stuff that you showed me early on, I was like, okay, like this team is, they're not just, doing this on the back of a napkin, right? Like there are project management tools involved. There are,
Yeah.
clearly some, and look up people's backgrounds too. I mean, go on LinkedIn, ask them for a reference,
Absolutely.
and then also say like, what was the biggest like oh shit scenario, right, that you ran into where you were able to fix it, right? Because we know that there's inevitably gonna be some kind of thing that you uncover, you were like, ah, crap, right? And so I think a lot of it is just like, how did you approach that scenario, and what was your success story?
Absolutely. Dean, you actually shifted left somehow, so I'm going to have you go next.
Okay, so when I was asked whether I could do this job, my first reaction was to go and understand what the problem was, understand what the issues might be with integrating with AS400. So I'm going to go and do some research. And that's what I would expect. If I was asking somebody to do this job, I would expect them to have done some research to understand the problem before I'm talking to them about anything, in detail. Maybe the first meeting you can talk about high level stuff, but by the second meeting, I would hope that that supplier has gone away and done their research and really understands what they're getting into, because you can be getting into a bit of a difficult thing because older systems, they they can be difficult. They can have issues. We had a particular issue on this project where there is a bug in the software that we have to use that was never fixed, and that software hasn't been developed for 15 years, and the bug is still there. So you want people to be in themselves, not just giving you a story, but actually you can trust them that they feel that they know what they're doing, basically. That would be my key recommendation.
Yep. And something to look forward to, as I know we're at time here,
Sure.
to look for is these over dependencies. Like the goal of trying to see if they can stand on their own in a project is often related to, do they have a connector, a tool, a way it's always been done that they keep going back to, right? That's a red flag. Not to say that that's the balance you need to strike. Like, have they done it before? But from a process perspective, from a scoping perspective, they know what questions to ask. And when they keep saying, "Oh yeah, this thing can do it. This connector can do it," that's not going to get the job done.
I agree. That's such a good point. It's something I had never thought of, but what you just said is true. They're selling features which you don't know if it's going to actually solve the problem yet. That's extremely pertinent. I would I've got one more I would add, which is I would ask to see their project deployment methodology. Like that should be documented somewhere, or even a sample of a project plan that you've done before.
Yeah.
I want to see what you do and what the result is in terms of documentation. What is your meeting cadence like? You know, how am I going to be hanging out with you? What does 6 months from now look like? How are you going to support it? Like these are all things I want to know.
Sure.
Well,
Are
this
we gonna get along? Do we like each other a little
do I
bit?
like you? Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well,
Thank
I
you
like
all
this,
very
Drew.
much. This was a great
Thanks
Yeah.
so much, fellas.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
bye.